Welcome to Vigilant News Interviews, everybody. Today we have a special guest, a returning guest, Courtenay Turner. Courtenay Turner has a fantastic podcast. She is also doing a series of events. She did Cause Fest, I believe it was in 2023, so that's something really exciting that I was able to participate in. Courtenay does fantastic research, deep dives work. She's got an incredible mind when it comes to not only the underlying philosophy of the deep state and how they work, but also a lot of the machinations they've had to influence our world through those machinations. So, Courtenay, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. This is our third one, I think, now, something like that. And It's always a great conversation.
Absolutely. I always enjoy it.
Excellent. So, you were just talking off air about this event you're putting on. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about that because this is a really cool event. Like there's a lot of like who's who that happens in the truther community, for lack of a better term, where you don't really get the deeper reasons as to why the cabal or the deep state does what they do and, you know, how they do it, especially at like a belief and ideology level. But it sounds like the event you're talking about, you were telling me about, is going to be something like that. Is that right?
That is right. Yeah. So it's called the Cognitive Liberty Conference. So it's cognitiveliberityconference.com, and you can get more information on it there. I was so excited that I actually got that URL, cognitiveliberityconference.com.
Nice.
Yeah, because usually you have to like come up with something that has nothing to do with what you're actually doing in order to get a URL, but I actually got that. So that was great. So it's a 2-day event, and we do have some limited, it's very limited just due to the venue, in-person tickets available for the second day. That's for August 17th, but this is a 2-day event. It's August 16th and 17th. August 16th will be live stream tickets only. And both days have live stream options. So no matter where in the world you are, what it is you're doing, and yes, of course, you will have access to those tickets even after the event itself. If you purchase the tickets, you will, if you do purchase live stream tickets or you come in person, you will have an opportunity to ask questions, or submit your questions in real time. So there is that opportunity for you as well. The first day is going to be on education. We know that some people call it the powers that be, the elite. I call them the parasite class. I think that's a much more appropriate term. But we know that one of their main mediums for being able to execute the New World Order is through education, or rather through eroding education. And so as Charlotte Iserbyt called it, the deliberate dumbing down of America. And I think that is really what we have witnessed. And it's, of course, not just America. We're seeing it really worldwide. But I think that the West is really being targeted, and primarily the United States of America, so that they can breed compliance and obedience and create world citizens instead of empowering them with tools to develop critical thinking skills. So we're going to go through the history of education, how we got to where we are, what is their agenda, and how can we stop it so that we can give children real tools for critical thinking, for flourishing, not in the way that they say flourishing, but true human flourishing and creative, independent thought processes, and so that they can really be all that they can be. So we're going to work on that. That's the first day, and they will do, kind of a short little introduction, background, and then we'll do kind of a roundtable discussion, and then there will be an opportunity for people to submit questions in real time to the panelists and to me if they wish, and we will try to answer those. And that's going to be the first day. And then the second day is an all-day event. It is an incredible venue. We are going to be in the heart of downtown Nashville. The location will only be disclosed to those who purchase the tickets because it is a private location venue. And so just in the name of nature of privacy and safety and all of that good stuff, and also just because it is incredibly limited, we will disclose it only to those who have purchased the tickets. But it is a beautiful venue and a rooftop right in the heart of downtown Nashville. And each of these speakers, so day one will be Tiffany Boyd, John Klyczek, School World Order. I know your audience is familiar with him.
Mm-hmm.
I've done several episodes with him. He is wonderful. And then Tiffany Boyd, who I've also done several episodes with, she's really a powerhouse in this field, and she has homeschooled her own children. She has 5 children and grandchildren. She's homeschooled them and helped other parents homeschool as well. And she's been really fighting in the against the vouchers, because now they're trying to nationalize them. It's not just in the States anymore. So this is a real concern. And then we also have Matthew Crawford, who has created his own schools. And in those schools, they were very successful, high test scores. They also were competing in math and succeeding, winning in math competition, which I feel like never happens in the United States. So he's a mathematician by trade. He has published several math textbooks. So this should be a fantastic panel. Day 2 is going to be focusing on political and psychological dialectical warfare, which, couldn't be more relevant now. And of course, we're going to get into a little bit of the background on that with Tavistock. I think they are kind of masters of that. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to be discussing that with Dr. James Lindsay, with Stephen Coughlin, Jay Dyer. If people want a little background on them, I did do an episode that was in person, it was a podcast with the 3 of them. And this is going to be an expanded version of that. They will each be speaking. And then we will also have added to the roster Michael O'Fallon and Dr. John Gentry. So they will each talk, and then we will have a little break, refreshments. People can mingle and discuss all the material they've just learned. And then we will have a roundtable discussion, and people can ask questions in person, and people can submit questions from the online audience. So, and we are taking sponsorships as well. And the sponsorship opportunity does give you an opportunity to and join us for it's going to be an incredible dinner opportunity with all of the speakers and the venue. So
nice.
Yeah. CognitiveLibertyConference.com, August 16th, 17th in Nashville.
Fantastic. Well, I'll put the link in the description, everybody, so you guys want to check that out. Sounds like it's going to be a really good event. Probably one of those things you have to watch like 5 times because there's just so much packed into it. So
I think so. It's going to be a lot of information, but I think it's just so important. People hear things like dialectics, and it sounds like it's just, academic, kind of like highfalutin verbiage, but it's so relevant and applicable to what it is that we're experiencing at this very moment. And I think that the more we recognize it, the better buffers and defenses we have against it. So that's my 100%. Hope. I think it's important that we do things in person. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a perfect kind of, event to talk about in the episode we're going to do today, because, for the audience that hasn't seen the first part of this, the link is in the description. This is the second installment of the Tavistock episode. And we got to talk a lot about kind of the precursors that built what I tend to describe as like the mega propaganda industrial complex, something like that. So, our culture has been weaponized in a really powerful way, especially now. We're living like 100 years after a lot of these things really got a lot of steam behind them. And it's so effective that most people don't even think about, what life was like beforehand. There's this thing about trad culture, which I think is a good kind of launching pad on just this, what we'll be talking about, like weaponized culture. And trad culture is the idea that, the husband and wife, they have a traditional marriage, which is great, don't get me wrong. But that's kind of like where the tradition ends, that there's no interface necessarily with the greater community, with friends and family, with the extended family. And from a psychological perspective, there's a book called Brain Rules for Baby that has many studies in it. It's a fantastic resource. I've been reading it because we're hoping to have a kid here soon. And it goes to show you how important healthy socialization is for children. And when you don't get it, how easy it is to manipulate a child, not only through the trauma that they experience through neglect, which neglect is actually the most powerful and destructive form of trauma out there, more destructive than sexual or physical abuse, believe it or not. So, when it's just mom at home taking care of babies and dad's out in the world working and there's barely anybody around her to help her, that is not an ideal situation. And they successfully destroyed our organic communities back in like the 1920s. So, and the mechanism that helped make that a reality is part of what we're going to talk about with Tavistock today. So, but where should we start? What do you think would be a good place to dive in somewhere?
Well, I guess maybe we can do just a little bit of a recap of what we talked about, like just a few minutes for people to understand that, a lot of people, when they hear Tavistock, they think the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. And that actually wasn't formed until 1946. And it was a Rockefeller grant that, made that possible. And I think that most people have really had no idea that there even was a Tavistock Institute until 2020, when the whole scandal with the transgender clinic occurred. And that was really a partnership that started in 2017 with the Charger Hospital and GIDS, and that, yes, they were shut down, but this is just like a very tiny arm of Tavistock. And I don't think that the initiative or the, greater picture is in any way derailed. So, but I am grateful that, at least it brought some attention. People really very few people had ever heard of Tavistock before. So, yeah, but what people need to understand is that it started out as a propaganda bureau. That is the inception of Tavistock, and really its primary initiative to this day is propaganda. And it started out, as we had gone through, it was at the Wellington House. It was the British War Propaganda Bureau, and this was really right before World War I. The whole purpose of it was to compete with the German War Propaganda Bureau, and it was to garner acquiescence from both the Brits and the Americans to engage in what they called the Great War at the time on the side of the Brits. And that was the whole purpose of it. And of course, some of the more prominent figures are people like Edward Bernays. I think most people are familiar with Edward Bernays, who's often known as the father of propaganda. He wrote the book on propaganda. However, I think that title might be a contender rival, might be Willy Munzenberg, but people don't often talk about him. But he, of course, Edward Bernays was the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, and his nephew is the founder of today's modern propaganda machine, also known as Netflix, right. Mark Randolph Bernays. And they were very instrumental in really so much of what has shifted the United States and our policies, our government structure. Even Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann were part of the Creel Commission that George Creel was appointed. We went through all of this to oversee Woodrow Wilson, who was the first president to openly say he was a New World Order president. And it was at the advice and guidance of Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann, who was a journalist, who were creating so much of this propaganda for things like the Federal Reserve, to convince the American populace that it was a great Christmas present for us to get a Federal Reserve Act and a income tax right for our Christmas present, in 1913. And for the Tariff Act, they convinced us that this was going to be wonderful for America, when, of course, in fact, that was a tremendous lie, as we are now seeing with the destruction of manufacturing. And really, there's almost no infrastructure for it left in this country. And so much of that began with things like the Tariff Act. So they were very instrumental in creating this propaganda that shifted the culture and the belief system, the hearts and minds of Americans. And it was really so that we would engage in war, which, surprisingly enough, people are actually not all that interested in doing. And we see this even today, right? But they create all these very, creative slogans and messaging that convinces people that it's going to be in our best interest. So I think that's a good thing for people to understand, is that when people are thinking about Tavistock, they started out as a propaganda bureau to engage us in the First World War, and not much has changed since. That's really what they were designed to do. And then, of course, it was in the 1920s when they actually became the Tavistock Clinic. That was when the name Tavistock came into the foray. And so, for more details on the British War Propaganda Bureau, we went through a lot of that in detail, so they can watch the last episode. But the Tavistock Clinic, came in around 1920, and it had occult ties from the very beginning. I would argue the British War Propaganda Bureau did too, because the Fabian socialists were very instrumental in the founding of the British Propaganda War Bureau. A lot of the members of the British Psychical Society, the British Research Society British Society for Psychical Research. I don't know why that's helpful for me, but but a lot of them were, involved in the inception of the British Propaganda Bureau. So, these were people who already had a lot of occult ties, a lot of interest in esotericism. I don't have the book in front of me, but I'm reading this book on Western mysticism and esotericism. It's a compilation of several essays, scholarly essays. So it's not, it's from an academic perspective, and they're edited by Alexander McGee. He wrote the book on Hegel and the Hermetic tradition. And his the reason I bring him up is because his kind of main thesis is that he presents throughout the book. I mean, he's just the editor, but it's a compilation, is the kind of distinction between mysticism and esotericism. And he posits that mysticism is very ancient, and this is and that it's actually unknowable in a sense. It's something that can only be intuited, and it's very hard to communicate. Whereas he posits that he asserts that esotericism is actually relatively new, and that it's more of a methodology, a means of manipulating perception. It's magic in a sense. And if through all sorts of various means, like, of things that are under the umbrella of being scientific, but they're really means of manufacturing manipulation of perception. So things like mentalism, spiritualism, alchemy, hermeticism. What else would be under that category? I guess just magic in general. But it's occulted. And so he says that they're inexorably connected, but that they're not, that one is much more ancient than the other. And so a lot of these, like the Fabian socialists who are connected to the British Society for Psychical Research, they're very interested in a lot of the esoteric type of techniques. And of course, the psychologists who were, from the very beginning, involved in the founding of Tavistock and even the British War Propaganda Bureau were mystics, people like Freud and Jung. But I think that's it's worth noting. And the occult ties to the Tavistock Clinic, the name came from the Duke of Bedford. He was the Marquis of Tavistock, and he had a direct connection to his last name is Russell. Let me see if I just don't want to get the name wrong, but his last name is Russell, and he is directly related to, I don't know why I always have a hard time saying it, but it's Kirschenrat Casimir Karl Wundt. He was related to, let me get the name. I'm going to, the Duke of Tavistock was I'm pretty sure he was the Duke of Bedford, and I want to say he had ties to, because Karl Casimir Wundt was related to, I think his code name was Raphael in the Illuminati. I know I'm blanking.
Yes, that's right.
and I'm trying to find where it was from. I know it was like the provincial report in Utica.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh,
Something I can find my notes somewhere, but I remember you mentioning that last time.
I mentioned it last time. Yeah. Um, but I think that that's worth noting, because we had also that this is why I was the connection to Carl Casimir Wundt, because Wundt was one of the earliest he was known as the father of psychology, and most of these Tavistock psychologists were influenced by him, and he was directly related to the Russell. Why am I blanking on this? Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, no problem. I'll jump in while you have a second to look for that. So why is it important to understand these things? Because, there's a lot of details to this story that might be glossed over. And I certainly, when I first got exposed to Tavistock, I didn't really quite get the magnitude of what I was seeing. But these people that have come up with this, they have a long tradition of manipulating people's minds. I would argue the same type of people who brought us the Eleusinian mysteries, the same type of people who brought us Gnosticism. So this is a very old tradition of messing with people's heads, to put it very simply. And there's a kind of science to this that they've been cultivating. I would argue it's been around for a long time, but they kind of, it got a secular revival in a lot of ways. And they brought in the tools of, modern science and psychology to really nail down what's something that I don't know if they knew exactly what they were doing. I just think maybe they thought it worked. But now we have like an almost industrial grade level machine that knows at a very precise level how to manipulate people's beliefs, their values, how do you weaponize their culture, their fundamental relationships, their perception through the media, all sorts of stuff. So, the reason why propaganda is effective on social media, the reason why you can be talking you can not even mention out loud that you're interested in a product, but then you'll see it on your phone and you'll be like, wow, it's like it read my mind. How did this happen? Well, it's because the people who brought us that technology are the same people that we're talking about right now, from a foregone age, 100 years ago. So go ahead.
Cybernetics and the Macy Foundation, and those have definite Tavistock connections. The Macy Foundations are tied to, and then later, of course, the Esalen Institute, all of those have ties to Tavistock and Tavistock psychologists. So yeah, so the Casimir Karl Wundt was the grandfather to Wilhelm Wundt, and he was known as Raphael in the Illuminati. I haven't found that, but I remember. And that was in the provincial report, the Illuminati provincial report of Utica. And it was the Marquis of Tavistock, was the 11th Duke of Tavistock. He was the one who donated the building specifically designated for shell shock therapy research. And that was the Tavistock building. And he was Herbert Arthur Russell, who was related to William Huntington Russell, who was the founder, along with Alphonso Taft, who was related to President Taft, and they were the creators of Skull and Bones. And I think that is just very important because of the ties of Tavistock and education. There's a lot of overlap with the mental health field. We're seeing this definitely today. Now it's really hard to tease them apart. And they've always been really tied. And this has occult ties as well, right? This is when you start looking into the founder of the World Core Curriculum, it's Robert Mueller, who worked for the UN for 38 years. And he said that the future of education is all going to be based on Alice Bailey and her Ascended Master, Djwal Khul. And then, of course, this is how we get Common Core, which Iserbyt calls a communist core. But so this Skull and Bones was very much tied to this, of the taking over of our education system. And a great resource for that would be Anthony Sutton's Order of Skull and Bones. And he has his whole middle chapter is all, like the middle section of the entire book is all about how the order controls and took over education. But I thought we would kind of get into some of the, like, kind of early on in the clinic, it really was, they were kind of competing with Mosley and Mapother and they're trying to build their prestige and credibility. And this is where they start doing all of these shell shock. The shell shock therapy research was done mostly at the Tavistock Clinic. Some of the more kind of medical, I put that in quotes, things like insulin shock therapy, that was really done out of like the Maudsley Hospital with Mappa there. And so those are kind of the early years, and this is where you see a lot of this book. It goes through a lot of the structuring history. It's 50 years of the Tavistock Clinic, Henry Dix, and it goes through kind of like a lot of just the logistical structuring of how they got their financing, how there were so many different trusts that were set up, which is very interesting to me. I think this is part of why so little is known about Tavistock, because a lot of it is done under these kind of shell trusts. Right. And so you can't really investigate too much into a trust. You can into like an LLC or maybe a 501c3 or some of these kind of NGOs, but it's very hard to investigate a trust. And a lot of they do. Mm-hmm.
I was going to jump in real quick with an interesting fact. So I study a lot of law, especially like the evolution of the legal system as it's developed over the past 1,000 years. And something very significant happened. 1666 was a significant date. That's when the Cestui Que Vie Act came out, a British act that basically began the birth of the Commonwealth system. The Commonwealth system was predicated on the idea that, you've heard of common law before, and people in modern days were like, oh, common law, it's great. It actually kind of acknowledges a few things, but not really, because it's predicated on the idea that people are incompetent, their soul is adrift, and through these trust structures grounded in the Roman Curia for the Vatican, that we can actually harvest or salvage people's souls. And we're going to create a kind of nanny state trust structure, which is based on the whole idea of a commonwealth. So the Commonwealth is the early nanny state. And in the 1900s in particular, 1800s, 19th century, there's several British parliamentary acts that talk about basically treating people as if they were cargo adrift at sea. And interestingly enough, a lot of the things that were happening around the early 1800s with the creation of the neo-admiralty law system, the system of creating, I forget the term, but it's an hospitalitary, I believe is the term, but it basically treats your legal person as a kind of you as a lunatic that's lost and dead at sea. And so they create this trust structure around that allows them to harvest your rights, sequester them in a place, and then when they're sequestered, now you have to engage with their system in order to access your rights. And this is all like very behind the scenes. None of it's like, out there in the public necessarily, but it is on the public record. And so it's just very interesting that as they were doing all of this kind of setup work for probably 100 years before the stuff that you're talking about started to get going, like the mid 1800s, late 1800s, they had this whole legal reform system that they were putting, finishing touches on. And then eventually all that led to the birth of the birth certificate system and all the stuff that goes with that. So anyway, just wanted to throw that little factoid out there.
Oh, I recently learned that the term human means a monster. And so it's a way that they can, erode any kind of legal recourse. Like you're
right.
Right, by calling you a human.
Exactly. It literally means of the soil. So, we're the more spirit, because they have 3 different classes of spiritual beings in the system. There's the person who knows who they are. They're a son of God, quote unquote, and they're actually here to do God's will, and they've recognized their rights and claimed possession of their estate. Then you have the human, which is the person who is like chattel, basically. They're like cattle or an animal. And without taking possession of their rights, which in their system, you have to do it by the time you're 7 years old, which who the hell knows how to do that when they're 7? Then they can classify you as a different being. And then there's an even older system that goes way back into the Aryan Manichaean religion, which classifies you as a soul that like, hey, if you're in this position as in this lifetime, then it's because you screwed up and you committed sin in the previous lifetime. And through that generational sin or that generational curse, we can kind of treat you as a lesser than human being. And this is kind of like the esoteric description of the world that they tell the elite. So the elite are like, oh, well, I guess we better go along with this because this is like our great, charitable work project to help the underhuman people who are basically one step above a cow. So anyway, not to get off on too much of a tangent.
Oh yeah, that's fascinating. I'm gonna have to do some more digging on that. I don't know too much about it, but yeah. But yeah, very interesting. So then we have this Tavistock clinic, and then we have like the Tavistock um what is it, the Tavistock medical psychology is what they called it. They were very like much trying to make it very much a credible science when a lot of this is all social science, but they kept trying to tie in like medical and then of course the field of psychiatry. But so we get the Tavistock Clinic, and then it was in 1932 that we get Kurt Lewin comes in. And Kurt Lewin, kind of an interesting character. He was a Frankfurt School refugee. He then worked for the MIT. He creates the Research Center for Group Dynamics. He's where we get the sensitivity training from. And he was also recruited by the Office of Naval Research to help with kind of like conflict resolution, and also to work with the spies, like that they were feeling isolated, and this is the way that they can become integrated. And essentially it's all brainwashing. And I've done a whole episode on sensitivity training, so kind of like a deep dive on that. But I think sensitivity training is really, really important for people to understand, because this comes out of Kurt Lewin had all sorts of, he was the father of topological psychology. He had this theory about people being a product of their environment, and that through their environment they could be convinced through peer pressure to give up even the most strongest of their convictions. And so this is very, yeah. And so essentially that we could brainwash people. And he also, he was one of the founders of the National Training Labs, which was their sister organization of the National Education Association. This is 1947, the National Training Lab began. And in their own manual, they say the sensitivity training is brainwashing. And I think like page, yeah, they literally say it. And then there was a CIA document. I believe it was I don't know if it was the document in 1974 or if that was when it was disclosed, declassified. But they say that they had wanted to see the efficacy of sensitivity training, but that in order to do that, they would have to actually conduct a study. And they said that the problem is that it was too reminiscent of Chinese brainwashing, and they didn't say exactly what, but I think they were alluding to like the Maoist struggle sessions in China. And they say that therefore they're not going to test it. They'll never know if it has any efficacy because they don't want to harm their military. There was also, interestingly enough, kind of related, there was a CIA document. It was called the Esalen Hot Tub Diplomacy. And kind of tangentially related to Tavistock, but they essentially were saying that through sex, drugs, and rock and roll, we're going to have world peace.
Right.
Yeah, so the Esalen Hot Tub Diplomacy document. But so this sensitivity training goes by, and that was really Kurt Lewin's specialty, and this goes by all sorts of different names. There's encounter groups, there's T groups. T groups is what they call sensitivity training for normals. And he was one of the forerunners of organizational development. I think I have him along with Eric Fritz. We have these different, so we have the social engagement of social science, the socio-psychological perspective. This is Eric Trist and Hugh Murray. I don't know if people can see it, but yeah, maybe not. But
yeah,
anyway.
Send me a link, I'll grab it. But
okay.
Yeah.
Yes. And then this one was really hard to get, but this is the operational research and the social sciences. And this was one of the Tavistock books also. So operational research is all about essentially behind the field of what we now call like organizational or developmental psychology. And it really does look like a lot of these group dynamic techniques and research projects that were done out of Tavistock is what has created corporate culture. And the sensitivity training is one of the ways that they've done this. So I had somebody recently come on, and I don't know if I can find the exact quote, that I don't have it in front of me, but it was about like group research. And so many of these, so there's Kurt Lewin, and then there was also Wilfred Bion, who was another Tavistock psychologist. And Wilfred Bion's research, he did a lot of research on group dynamics, and his research is what led to the A.K. Rice Institute, and that is known as like Tavistock in the United States. It's kind of like their Tavistock offshoot in the United States. And so a lot of them were, very invested in studying group dynamics, group research, and they actually said, and I wish I had the quote in front of me, but that they were trying to figure out how group research could shift and manipulate people's perspectives, opinions, and values. So essentially, how you could create groupthink, and that's what these psychologists were doing. And through organizational psychology, that's essentially what you have. So you have Kurt Lewin, who comes up with his theories, like he had it was a freeze, change. It was unfreeze, change, refreeze. Although they say that it actually was never called refreeze, that was later attributed to his theory, that he actually never said that. But it's this is how you create these change agents. And both Kurt Lewin and Wilfred Bion was really invested in studying how you could have like leaderless groups. And this is very interesting in what we're seeing today, because of a lot of the, not just corporate culture, but now you're seeing this kind of in this mentality that's being pushed through all of these NGOs, right? So you're seeing things like the World Economic Forum, didn't Klaus Schwab just talk about how we need to have collaboration, cooperation, not leadership? And this is, of course, this idea of the collective mindset. So they were literally creating groupthink through these dynamics. So sensitivity training, I've actually experienced, and some people may be familiar with things like Landmark Forum, or have you heard of Landmark Forum?
I have.
So there's like many offshoots. I didn't do Landmark, but I did two others that are like literally just offshoots of Landmark. And so remember, I was talking about how they have they recruited him for the Office of Naval Research to help with the spies, and to help with conflict resolution. And this was something Kurt Lewin himself was very interested in, because he was actually very sympathetic to the Nazi movement, and then he felt very betrayed because he was Jewish, and they of course kicked them all out. This is why he became a refugee, a Frankfurt School refugee, because in 1933 the Frankfurt School kind of disbanded and they had to move. This is when they came over to the United States. Most of them set up shop in the Institute for Social Research at Columbia University, and we now have several offshoots like in Michigan and throughout the country, really. There are several different institutes for social research, but that's they kind of first started off setting up shop in Columbia University. But he was very interested in this concept of race and race identity and discrimination. And so sensitivity training, when I was saying, like, I've had personal experience in this, when you go to these, they talk about like win-win, and so this is all a way to get everybody into the collective. Now, I'm not saying that it's not great, like if you're in business, to figure out how it can be a win-win for everybody. Obviously, you want to do that, but you still have your individual, desires, needs, motives. But this is really about how we can erode all of that. And they do a lot of it through, as you were saying, these are tactics that I agree come out right out of things like the Eleusinian mysteries and the ancient Egyptian mystery schools. And this is all of these like trauma-based mind control type tactics. And I literally experienced it. They do a lot of role playing. And this is all stuff that comes out of sensitivity training, but later was used in things like EST, SLN, and of course in the corporate culture, but they do things like role playing. They do things like you know like trauma bonding. They do things
Mhm.
like where you have to reveal your innermost like darkest secrets and trauma, and now this is how you bond. This is trauma bonding. And then of course that can be, and then they love bomb you, and then these things get weaponized
Exactly.
against. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Mhm.
no, you're gonna say, yeah.
I was going to just jump in on that because, people might think like, oh, well, if you have a healthy relationship where you're talking about these things with somebody, then does that mean you're like using these techniques? And I would say no. Psychologically, a lot of the reason these things work for these people is because they take things that we kind of should be doing anyway, but they
Mhm.
weaponize it. And what's interesting is that at a deep psychological level, this is something that was popularized in the 1910s. It's called the looking glass. Uh,
Mhm.
Look, have you heard about looking glass? Like so, looking glass self is what it is, and basically, it's the when you share something with another person, there's a part of your identity that's actually adjusted through that process, the way that they validate you, the facial expressions they make, all sorts of very subtle things that you wouldn't think would have that much of an effect can really have a massive, powerful effect on your value system and your belief system. And the things we're kind of need to be doing anyway, because in a healthy relationship, whether it's with your family or a workplace or your community, you need that level of social trust where you can process experiences, thoughts, business ideas with people around you that you can trust. But when it's weaponized by subversive people, then obviously that's not good. So just wanted to throw that out there for everybody.
Yeah, and so that's what's really interesting, because I know people think of like group therapy as being something that's very hopeful and can be very cathartic, but it can also really be weaponized. And a lot of what they were studying was ways to create groupthink, ways to manipulate people through peer pressure, and ways to control them through trauma-based mind control. And
Right.
so, unfortunately, they've used group therapy and they studied group therapy as a way to erode you of your own identity. Because what happens when
Mhm.
when you've now divulged all of these secrets, or you've now acted out in front of somebody, your like deepest, darkest, either experiences, traumas, or fears. Now you're kind of attached to them, and now you've
Yes.
created this shared identity. You lose part of yourself, and you do that for safety purposes, because what happens if you're because you've now made yourself so vulnerable, so you're
Mhm.
not going to dissent from those people that you've now just created this trauma bond with. And
That's
that is
right.
a lot of what they were studying and really weaponizing.
Wow.
So that's
Fascinating.
and
Yeah.
Yeah, and we see that now through that's what has become like the kind of the foundation for things like critical race theory, for things like
Hmm.
identity politics, which really came out of the Frankfurt School, but so much of the Frankfurt School were refugees at Tavistock. So the Tavistock psychologists were now conducting studies and experiments to see how they could, where the breaking points were. And if you can calculate the breaking points, then you can trigger them. So,
Right.
yeah, right.
Fascinating.
So, unfortunately, so that was Kurt Lewin, and he, um, and he was a director for the Tavistock Institute, for Tavistock Clinic at that time. And then the director that succeeded him was John Rawling Rees. John Rawling Rees wrote Shaping Psychiatry by War. And I think the way we can think about this, I know people get very interested and very excited when they hear it. I think it's just salacious. When they hear Tavistock, a lot of people start thinking about like the Beatles, and they think about the Grateful Dead, and a lot of the cultural manipulation. We'll definitely get into all of that. I'll unpack all of that.
Mhm.
And it's definitely very relevant. But I think the part that people often ignore, or they're not as interested in, is how so much of this is done through wartime research.
Mhm.
And if you think about the British Propaganda Bureau, which preceded the Tavistock Clinic that became Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, it was all around creating propaganda to, engage in the First World War. And
Right.
that's really where a lot of these studies were done in order to learn how to manipulate and mind control. And so from there, we have the World War II, and John Rawling Rees writes this book, Shaping Psychiatry by War. So now, when you have wartime research, you have black ops, like covert budgets, right? Like nobody, you can't investigate where money went, what research was actually done. The most we have are these little crumbs that we get from declassified documents or from whistleblowers, but we don't really have access. We don't know what they're doing. So they have full control, full purview, and they can be conducting the darkest studies that you could possibly fathom. And through even just the little crumbs that we've received through these declassified documents and whistleblowers, some of what we've seen is so incredibly horrific. It's hard to actually fathom that human being could do this to another human. And
Unit 731, I think, the Japanese unit. Have you heard about that one?
yes,
Yeah, really horrible stuff. Yeah,
really awful, really awful. I mean, there's so many of them. I mean, there was like the in Vietnam, like the weather manipulation stuff that they were experimenting. The Tavistock was dropping bombs in this was during World War II, just to see the reaction, like on civilians, just to see, like just to see how people would react. What kind of trauma would that create? Even to go back to more of the cultural stuff, we had mentioned War of the Worlds experiment that was done
right.
in 1933. But I mean, that was pretty traumatic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was, from what I read at anyway, I'm not an expert on the subject, but the people, when this was being broadcast, people legitimately thought that there was like an alien invasion happening. And, just to give people a taste, like, the current society we live in, we use these cell phones, and these cell phones are gathering a tremendous amount of data about us, our biometrics, our emotional state, our behavior, what we talk about, all this kind of stuff. So it's really like kind of like the people who originated the things you were just talking about, like Unit 731 and the War of the Worlds and all these people. Imagine their wet dream come to fruition, which basically is that you could have a perfect surveillance state to capture all the data you need to on all the various ops you're doing. So while you're engaging these ops and trying to manipulate people's minds, you're also getting the data feedback you need to perfect the process and basically conduct nonstop real-time experiments on the people without them ever realizing it. And that's the world we live in today. So it's remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of, I think, like a lot of my research on Tavistock has been focused on like what has come out of this wartime research, because I think from there, that's really what was extrapolated out to the masses and to corporate culture. And I think they're using the corporate culture in order to achieve their goals of the New World Order, because they're creating supranational kind of entities and the best example of this would be like during COVID, right? It doesn't matter really what your laws were, because if you went into any kind of supranational corporation, you were subjected to the policies that they implemented. And that when you read the writings of the elite, that's kind of what they say, is that we're no longer going to have sovereign nation states. We're going to have kind of reminiscence of like power blocks, and then we'll have complete subversion where in the AI world society, they say that it's all going to be controlled by AI, and we won't even have human governments at all. But I think the stepping stone to that is to have these supranational corporate entities, and a lot of them create the culture. What's promulgating a lot of the woke culture that we see, all the DEI that we see, and this all comes out of Kurt Lewin's sensitivity training and his topological psychology and the group dynamics research that he did. It was at MIT, the Research Center for Group Dynamics. So, and they started the Human Relations Journal, which that had a long kind of a run with, and they became kind of the main journal for Tavistock. So we see all of that kind of come to fruition today. So, but a lot of it was done under wartime research. And then, of course, even the shell shock therapy, that's essentially studying post-traumatic stress and trauma-based mind control. And I think a lot of that paved the way for what became the MK Ultra experiment. And then we have World War II, and they created something called the War Office Selection Boards. And this was Wilfred Bion and Eric Trist. And Eric Trist, a lot of people may know, his son was Alan Trist, and Alan Trist was the manager for the Grateful Dead. So this is where we start getting these ties, right? But they created these war office selection boards, and this is, most people don't talk about it, and this is where I think a lot of the ideas of how to select leaders, they then took the research from Kurt Lewin on change agents, and they're very instrumental in that today. Like the Leicester Conference that has been going on since 1957 is in Leicester, England, and they talk about it right on their website openly, like, to create change agents. And I can show you that. It's really interesting. They have this whole thing where they talk about like Gnostic Reticulus. It's now your time. This is an awakening organization. When they say awakening, they don't mean, like, a lot of times when we hear awakening, we think like people waking up, they're learning,
Right.
they're understanding the realities of nature and what's going on in the world. That's not what they mean. They mean the inversion. They mean awakening, which is where we get, woke from. And it's really this very Gnostic kind of a reference to illumination. And that really does seem to be kind of the underbelly of all of this. It's and when you start to look at the individual players, I think I can make a very cogent argument that that's the case. But so the wartime selection boards were this method, and this were ways that they could choose officers for the British Army. And it was they had created these psychological methods and testing, and it was out of a Tavistock group. Wilfred Bion and Eric Trist were some of the most prominent members who were working on this. And they say that they were working on, like, they were testing intelligence, but then of their own mission, they say it really wasn't intelligence that they were looking for. Let's see if I can go through some of the specifics of it. Yeah, like they say mental ability, and they say, though they were often called intelligence tests, advisor John Raven, empathetic to that of several of the tests used at the War Office Selection Boards, were not intelligence tests, but tests of mental ability. Tests included verbal and nonverbal reasoning tests, a version of Reagan progressive matrices that were specifically created for the War Office Selection Boards to better distinguish between those at the highest end of mental ability scales. And then they talk about psychological pointers, the various psychological pointers that were used to help highlight I want to back up a little bit. When they say, like, they're really looking for people who are going to be like mental ability is like the adaptability, who's going to be moldable. And this is very reminiscent of, and I do think this came out of Tavistock, although I haven't found the direct tie to it yet. I'm just going to look for the actual document, but it was a declassified CIA document, and it was called From Mice to Rascals. And it was about, like, selecting intelligence assets or assets in general. And mice was for money, I was ideology, C was a double entendre. It was either compromise or coercion. And then E is ego. But they then switched, and they said that they actually found that it would be, this came out of a recruitment training for the OSS. So I do think it was Tavistock through what they call the Invisible College. And there's lots of articles, and you can look this up with Churchill talks about that was like his secret weapon was this Invisible College, which were these Tavistock psychologists who helped him. So this is mice, and then they go to rascals, and let me see if I can find what. So rascals is reciprocation, always provide amenities. This is one of the earliest lessons taught to case officers in their training. Whether the meeting is to be an extended discussion in a hotel or quick talk in a moving car, the case officer is told to always have something for the role player agent to eat and drink. If student asks why, which is never encouraged, the likely reply would be to build rapport, or the old standby that this is what I thought. This is what the way I was taught. It is an honest question that deserves a better response. The true answer never lies in the principle of reciprocation. All humans feel an obligation to try and repay in kind what the other person has provided.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's reciprocation, and they go on like for quite a while on that. And then the second one is authority. And this is a lot of what they were testing in the War Office Selection Boards. So, and then they come up with this actual like acronym for it. The OSS advice: from the first, given an impression that we are part of a powerful and well-organized body, prestige counts heavily. This is very similar to, ego in the mice, but they decided the rascals was actually a better method. So they say from childhood, we are taught that compliance with authority brings rewards, while resistance brings punishment. Most operational cover stories are built to give CIA officers an air of authority through some official government status or the appearance of successful business person. In both cases, officers are encouraged to look the part in their dress with props. And so they go on. Obviously,
Wow.
we understand what authority means. Yeah, they have like these several questions. They say, does an agent fully disclose subsources of information? Has an agent attempted to establish limits subjects will not report about? Is an agent willing to admit when he does not know about a topic, and will he take reasonable risks to gain that information? Is an agent knowingly providing information that would get him in trouble if discovered? And how closely does an agent adhere to the directions in a case officer gives concerning the methods of collecting information and moving to and from meetings? So then they also say authority plays a key role in the handling, training, and turnover phases of the recruitment cycle. Then the next one is security. When an item is less available to humans, tend to believe it is more attractive. Things that are rarer are normally more expensive. Humans tend to equate expense with quality. So they're talking about scarcity. Sorry, scarcity. So we have now. So this is the first part of the rascals. We've got reciprocation, authority, scarcity, and then we have C is commitment and consistency. And then the L is for likening. We like people who are like us. And then the last one is social proof. And of course, social proof. This is definitely all like, how do we get social proof? And the sensitivity training is a huge part of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if anybody's ever studied marketing before, all of those principles are just totally baked into most of the modern theories of marketing. Priming is a big one. You say things in the right way to prime somebody to be more open to your ideas.
Yes.
You give them food. There's that show. God, I can't remember. It's the one about the salesman in the 50s, the marketers in the 50s, and they would like be partying all the time and doing drugs and going to restaurants, and it's like everything's just baked in. What you were just talking about is in these industries. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, well, they really created they created the field of, right, I said that their journal was human relations. So like it was personnel, but now it's human relations, right? That's like the whole field of like managing corporations. And they created that field. They created organizational development, which became organizational psychology. And this is, of course, ways that you can, from within, you can create corporate culture, which then manipulates and socially engineers the people within that environment. And so much, I think it's one of the ways that they've been really successful of subverting America is through corporate culture. And, this is not to say that all of corporate culture is bad or negative or, but it's from within that they've been able to create this environment that has the potential to create culture, socially engineer the masses, and steer us. So, yeah.
We here at Vigilant News want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to gain freedom and deal a blow to the powers that be. One of the things that the powers that be do is they wage biological, psychological, and spiritual war on us. And there's a whole bunch of very important things that we need to do to defend ourselves from each of those types of war and build up our strength, our resources, and our unity so that we can actually make decisive blows against the enemy and not each other. One of the things that's important to do for that is health. And that's why Vigilant News partnered up with Ascent Nutrition, who's really the leading, as far as I can tell in my research, the leading nutritional company out there. There's a lot of nutritional companies out there, but Ascent Nutrition offers some of the best nutrition that you can imagine, because Lance Shetler, the guy who founded Ascent Nutrition, he's like us. He wants to provide high quality nutrition, and the defense is against the ceaseless biowarfare waged against us. As everybody knows now, because of COVID, we have a nonstop, highly funded, highly coordinated, health-destroying machine that is pointed directly at our children, at each other, and our friends and families. And it's surprising how many of us aren't necessarily doing the best things we could. So that's why we partnered with Ascent Nutrition. I wanted to show you guys some of the really amazing products they offer. Do humic and fulvic acid. Humic and fulvic acid helps absorb or chelates heavy metals. So chelation is the process where heavy metals get like magnetically sucked out of our body. And it turns out, if anybody's not aware of this, a lot of vaccines have tons of heavy metals in it. We have heavy metals like strontium and various other heavy metals being sprayed in from the atmosphere via geoengineering, which, thanks to the recent Tennessee bill that was just passed, is finally being acknowledged. So we've been, all this global warming nonsense is probably just from the geoengineering that we've been dealing with. But it's more than that. It's bioengineering. They're literally changing the face of the earth through terraforming, and part of it involves heavy metals. Well, you can help guard against these heavy metals with humic and fulvic acid. They'll help strip it from the body. Ours in particular is in a hyper bioavailable form. Even though we have to put an expiration date on there, it technically doesn't expire because the compound is literally millions of years old. But the FDA makes us do stupid stuff, for their own reasons, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you. The other thing about our humic and fulvic acid is it's tiny. It literally fits in a nano-sized amount or dosage, in the sense that, to use a fancy buzzword, it's tinier than most humic and fulvic, so it can get into those hard to reach places in your bodies. That also helps break down pesticides. It actually has been shown to help break down radiation. So if Fukushima is, scaring you, this is something that can help. Or the radiation from these things, portable radiation devices that we carry around with us all over the place, it can help with that. It can also help with microplastics as well. Agarikon mushroom was studied by the Department of Defense in the BioShield program. Paul Stamets talked about agarikon mushroom when he was on Joe Rogan. And it has the power to neutralize tons of different biowarfare agents. It can help neutralize COVID. It can help neutralize pox. It can help neutralize bird flu and swine flu and all the various other flus. It can help neutralize anthrax. It can help neutralize plague. It can neutralize a ton of different things. Now, as I was leaving an event earlier this year, the Reawaken America Tour event in Detroit, I got a really weird sickness. I can always tell when I'm getting sick. It's a very signature feeling that I get in my respiratory, especially my sinus tract. And it was like that, but it was like 10 times more irritating. It was really strange. And then I didn't have any of the other symptoms that I normally get. It's like I sniffed glass all night long. And I'm not talking about the drug. I'm talking about like the actual ground up glass. So when I got back from the flight, I started to feel it. The last day I was there, I got home from the flight. I was experiencing this peak, itchy, irritated feeling. I took some of that agarikon. I put it in a little water. I let it sit for 10, 15 minutes to get absorbed in the water. And I gargled it for 5 minutes. I gargled that stuff. And it literally froze whatever I was experiencing in its tracks. And for the next 3 or 4 days, I still had this weird thing that was happening that, again, felt like no other sickness I've ever experienced before. Very similar to COVID, by the way, when I was sick with COVID in 2021. but this stuff throws it in its tracks. I strongly suggest getting this stuff too. Again, studied by the Department of Defense. There are dozens of other amazing products here. These are just some of the ones that they have available. As all sorts of different things here. So I strongly suggest you use promo code Justin Stillness, and you can save 10% off. You can also save when you do a subscription. The subscription will not only give you points and that you can use and get free products down the line, but you can also save 10% every time that subscription goes out, and you get free shipping. So it's just like Amazon. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for supporting your health, supporting your mind, and staying on the digital battlefield. Let's get back to the interview. I mean, it's just like we were talking about earlier, like a lot of the things you heard about, like reciprocating, like, giving somebody a drink and wanting to be more open to your ideas. Like, these are things that are just built into human beings, period. And I think this is why it requires an ethical framework, because you have to actually know that in order to gauge somebody ethically, in order to actually create a good partnership, you got to have a meeting of the minds. And a meeting of the minds is about being transparent and honest about what your interests are, what objectives you're trying to get done, your risks. And so if you're on the same page with somebody and you're honest about what your interests are, then, having them over for dinner isn't necessarily manipulating them, because it lifts the decision-making process out of the subconscious where groupthink really has a hold on somebody and brings it into the conscious realm. However, the problem with that is, especially in the modern ages, most people don't know how to make rational decisions anymore. So it's like, this is something I've dealt with. I do business consulting, and you'd be surprised how many business owners and people in business, period, the mechanism by which they're guiding the ship that is their business is very like a gut-based, intuitive, level, which is good. We got to run by our gut sometimes, but a lot of you can just blindly forge right into a swamp or a quagmire of landmines if you're not careful. And it's because you got to know how to actually make good decisions. And a lot of that involves a counsel. Like, I forget the phrase, but it's like, don't keep your own counsel. And if we don't know how to have good relationships with other people, then our ideas might seem a lot better than they actually are. But when you just talk to somebody about it and you have that ability to have rapport with them and rationalize, you can go, oh, well, geez, I didn't realize you're right. Now that I'm talking to you about it, I think about it differently. Like, how many times have you heard that before? So yeah, I mean, it's just to put a button on what I'm saying here. When we hear these things, you might think, oh my God, like, I'm having people over for dinner and, that's because I want to talk to them about something. I'm a bad person. Or, but they took humanity and they found a way to weaponize it in and of itself, I think. And that's really the big takeaway here.
Yeah, well, and it's also that when you talk about like rational decision making and thought process, so what they've determined is that a person under stress, and of course, this is what happens when you induce a trauma, right? A person who is under stress is much more likely to react versus to be rational and, clear thought and intentional in their thought processes and their decision making. And so that's what they do with these groups. They create trauma so that now you are no longer acting from your rational brain. You're now reacting in a survival mode. And so that's a huge part. That's the problem, essentially. So
yeah. And the economy, I mean, think about it. Like, when you're trying to get a new job, are you in a state of stress? When you're trying to manage anything in life, you're usually coming from a place of stress. Like, oh my God, I just lost my job. My social standings, been torpedoed. My access to the things I need, my relationship with my wife or my friends and family is put at risk. And so you're kind of like in the worst mental state you can imagine when you're trying to find a new job, which makes you very desperate and very easy to accept things that maybe you wouldn't, something like that. So
absolutely. Yeah. They're
fascinating.
So these group dynamics is they're creating an environment where you're under stress. And, they say things like that. They talk about how, like, they think that we should secretly be fifth columnists and we should infiltrate, right? This was Reese, who said, we can therefore justifiably stress our particular point of view with regards to proper development of the human psyche. Even though our knowledge may be incomplete, we must aim to permeate every educational activity in our national life. How do we do that? Infiltrate the most pervasive institutions in social culture, the education system, the church. Public life, politics, and industry should all be within the sphere of influence. If we are to infiltrate the professional and social activities of other people, I think we must imitate the totalitarian and organize some kind of fifth column activity. If better ideas on mental health are to progress and spread, we as the salesmen must lose our identity and therefore all become very secretly fifth columnists. So that was 1940. Yeah.
No kidding. I mean, geez, and it just shocks me how like open they are about what they talk about sometimes. Like if you know how to read it with the proper lens, you're basically seeing that they're like, hey, we're about to go do this to the world, everybody. You know, try to stop us, something like that. It's just so in your face sometimes.
They're so open. And I wonder like how much of what the individuals who are involved, how much of it is like inherently sinister, or if they really thought they were doing like best by humanity. They thought like what they were doing was they were acting in good faith. I
Right.
think a lot of them really were. I think that it's that the the people at the top who have an agenda, and I would actually argue even some of the people whose agenda is the New World Order, they think that that's the best plan of action for humanity. They think that they actually think that that's going to be good for us. It doesn't matter that some of us may cease to exist as a result, but it's for the greater good.
I mean, I think you're spot on, because as far as I can tell, it's like, it's like the Russian doll phenomenon. It's not like there's this one line where on the outside of the inside club, the New World Order club, you don't know anything. You're just a regular person. But then when on your inside and the inside, you know about all the various insidious things they're doing. And you've just got like a total red in status. I don't think that's the way at all. I think they have, just like in a corporation, the guy who works at Walmart doesn't know everything that the board of Walmart's doing. Exactly. There's all these layers, and they need narratives. That's where this whole idea of peak oil comes from, or the overpopulation, or there's these kind of neo-secular myths, even quasi-religious myths, that they sell the middle tier managers of society, the people that are using these tools, thinking they're doing a good thing, not realizing that they're enslaving their own fellow humans. Just like all the people who did the COVID. COVID's a beautiful example, well, horrific example, but I mean, very clear example of the very thing we were just talking about. Is like how many people did things at the behest of the NIH and Fauci and all these, horrific modern day Dr. Mengelas, killing millions of people, inflicting this horrible vaccine on millions of people, all while thinking they were doing good and right by humanity. So
yeah, I think COVID seems to me like a Tavistock blueprint. It really looks like it came straight out of Tavistock kind of mass scale trauma-based mind control plans. But
yeah, 100%. Yeah.
I can't prove that, but with everything that I've studied, it really seems like it's right in line with what they.
I mean, it came out of the same basic set of institution. As the genealogy there, like you've been discovering through your research, is there. We might not be able to pin down who was in the board meeting when the COVID got approved, but the techniques are there for. So
so the war office selection boards, going through the rest of that, some of the techniques were used by the Army psychologists in the early investigations of problems with repatriated prisoners. Sorry, I can't say that, of war. No problem. For records relating to the Civil Resettlement Unit program. The war or office selection boards were a precursor to the Army office selection boards that's in place today. So that this, and very few people talk about this. Like this is, this was kind of a covert. It led to what was called Operation Phoenix, not the Operation Phoenix done by the CIA, but this was a whole restructuring of Tavistock. So they completely like restructure their entire, infrastructure of the clinic, and how they picked their psychologist and their really just their whole infrastructure. But it was taking some of the things that they had learned from all of this War Office Selection Board testing. And really, I think what they were looking for was, like who would be good change agents, who would be good leaders, who are going to be good followers, who are going to like be good soldiers. And a lot of this is very much in line with what you see out of the research for like the GATE program. The CIA declassified documents have on what happened with Gates, and how they were really looking for essentially change agents. They say leaders, they call them, but I think it's leaders who are going to groom this new age for humanity. I think a lot of that came out of when you start looking into what they were doing with these War Office Selection Boards. And then, of course, they were later used for the Civil Service Selection Boards, which are used for, they were used for the OSS, they were used for major corporations like Unilever, like just a lot of major companies that we know of today use these same testing that they were, that comes out of this Tavistock. And then the staff who created the War Office Selection Board found that they had many shared interests, and that they called themselves the Invisible College. And this is what Churchill referenced, that this was like his secret weapon, was this invisible college that helped him in World War II. And the Invisible College were the precursors to the Royal Society. And then, of course, later they formed the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. And it was a grant from the Rockefellers that made that possible. So I don't know. I like to kind of go through some of that, because I think really what we need to take away from Tavistock is how much was done during wartime, and what they learned from. I mean, Reese wrote a whole book, Shaping Psychiatry by War, and all the lessons that we could learn. And don't they do this and you could think of COVID as kind of a war, right? And what did Klaus Schwab write? He wrote COVID-19 and the Great Reset. And what was it all about? It was about all the lessons that we were going to learn about how we could save the planet and save the environment from the lessons that we learned through the pandemic that hadn't actually occurred at the time when he wrote this book. As I always like to say, it's pretty easy to predict the future when you plan it. So
that's great. Yeah. 100%. Let me ask you real quick, because you mentioned the Gates program. Do you know much about it? Can you give our audience a little bit of a taste on that?
I mean, I know it was the Gifted and Talented Education Program. This is, it was under the guise that they were doing kind of advanced education for quote unquote gifted students. I was part of the CTY, which was like the Center for Talented Youth, which was in partnership with Johns Hopkins. And but it's a very similar kind of thing. What I can say is that I personally have no recollection of it at all, and apparently I'm not rare in that.
Wow.
The CIA had tried to recruit me when I was 7 years old, and I always thought those were very separate incidences. But I've talked to someone who was actually a Monarch programmer for the CIA. Yeah. And he said there's no way they were isolated incidences. He believes that they were definitely connected. The CIA had pursued trying to recruit for something like 9 months. Fortunately, my parents said no. But the CTY program that I did, and I really never thought much about it. When I was moving out of California, I was cleaning out, and I found a letter my mom had sent to me, like saying she was so proud of me for being accepted into this program. And then I remember, I was like, oh yeah, it was like something with Johns Hopkins. I remember that. And I only remember the first day. So all I really remember was being in this classroom, and like I sat across from this girl who I had known from nursery school. I was super excited. I ran into a friend, and she was a very kindred spirit because everybody's going to laugh at me. But I guess I've always been a bit of a divergent kind of a personality. But I we would so in nursery school, like it's a militarized education system, right? So this is
Mm.
what I talk about when I go through the history of the Americanization of Wundt, Wilhelm Wundt, which Anthony Sutton does a really good job of explaining. There's a tiny little book, and I don't have it in front of me. Everything's a mess right now, but it's called The Leipzig Connection. I think I brought it the last time, and that goes through very well as well. So just if people are interested in the sources, but so they wouldn't let us go to the bathroom. And I remember, like, I was particularly annoyed about this during nap time. Like, we're not learning anything. This is, it's nap time. And
Right.
I said, it's nursery school. I'm like, we go through all these, like they teach you potty training, and then they don't let you decide when your body tells you need to go to the bathroom. I was like, this is so arbitrary. I was really upset by it. And she was like my kindred spirit, who was also really upset. And we would throw tantrums. Why can't we go to the bathroom when we want to?
Good for you.
But anyway, so I remembered her, and I saw her. She was in this program, and I hadn't seen her, since nursery school. And so that's all I remember, though. The strangest thing, I remember there were some other, like, I know we did with kind of like SATs. There was a lot of like word problems and math word problems and kind of like puzzle solving. But I really don't remember anything the whole summer.
Mm.
And
Wow.
what's I didn't think much about that. I didn't really give much credence to it. And it's not because I didn't remember. But I saw there was a whole thread on Twitter that Emma Catherine is doing on her channel, the Imagination podcast. She's doing a lot of interviews with people who have been in these GATE programs, and a lot of them have no memories at all. And
wow.
so what's really, and then the people who do, a lot of them have some very traumatic. Some of them say it's not traumatic. There's like people talking about like drinking pink liquid and like some sort of like technological kind of experiments. And I think a lot of that was frequency testing. At least, so now when you look at the CIA documents, they do talk about how they were doing all sorts of testing with these GATE programs. And they say that they were seeking people who would be leaders in the new age. And so kind of reminds me of like, Changing Images Man document, which was the Stanford Research Institute studies that they were doing. And that was done, the first edition was 1972, and then and that was connected to Tavistock also. All the like Tavistock psychologists and Stanford Research Institute is kind of like one of these offshoots, Tavistock offshoots. But they were doing they finally published their final edition in 1984, and this was Willis Harman and M.W. O.W. Markley, and he they were the project directors for this, but there were a lot of psychologists involved in this, and it was all about essentially like they wanted to popularize the ideas of how we could usher us into a new age, the age of Aquarius from the Piscean age. And that was when Marilyn Ferguson's book, Aquarian Conspiracy, was published as a means of popularizing those ideas. And Marilyn Ferguson was the assistant to Willis Harman. And so she had written that book. And so it just reminds me of that, though, that they're kind of like, it's these studies that were done with the intention of steering. And they do admit it when you read their writings. This isn't like my inference. I'm not, projecting onto them. They really do say we need to, like Changing Images Man, they make it really clear we need to move past the industrial era and move into the Aquarian age, which of course is the new age, the new world order.
Right.
And the GATE studies were that they do the documents that I read do that's basically what they say. They were looking for those leaders. And when you look at, I guess, like leaders who would be change agents, essentially. So now we're back to Kurt Lewin with the change agent.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know too much. I know some people have had traumatic experiences, but a lot of them don't remember anything at all. And what I do know from Tavistock studies is that it's very easy to do amnesiastic, uh, you know, where you can erase memories. That's actually pretty easy to do. What's not easy to do is create false memories, but they can do it through stress. So when people are in a state of heightened stress or trauma, it's much easier. They're much more susceptible to having implantation. So,
the double bind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Because, you know, when you say monarch, I'm assuming you're referring to the one that specifically uses children who are abused sexually in dynastic incest families. Is that the same one?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be sexual abuse, but it's intergenerational trauma. Oftentimes is sexual abuse. But it's really intergenerational trauma, in utero trauma. And, you know, I think another reason why they do a lot of these studies through wartime research is not just because of the covert nature and the Black Ops budget, so they have unlimited money essentially with no kind of accountability, but I think it's also because soldiers are, you know, under a state of heightened stress and trauma. And I mean, that's kind of how the Tavistock Clinic started, right? It was all about studying post-traumatic stress disorder with soldiers and what they call shell shock therapy. And I think that that's a huge part of why they do this through wartime research. So it's, you know, it's not nearly as sexy as a lot of the cultural kind of studies, but I don't think that they could have done the cultural infiltration and social engineering that they've done without doing the wartime research. That's really, and they systematize it, you know, like we're seeing with the war office selection boards. You know, they come up with very specific methods and testing in order to be able to then systematize the social engineering that they do. So,
well, you know, to harken back to what we talked about earlier, which ties directly to this, like neglect is one of the most powerful forms of abuse. It's far more powerful than sexual and physical abuse. So just not getting the attention you need is enough to induce a tremendous stress on the central nervous system. And then through that stress, you can heighten certain types of, you know, programming, for lack of a better term, but indoctrination, things like this. And so it's hard for modern people to understand this, but in other parts of the world, this still happens. You have mom has a baby, dad's there, but then you also have like 3 other couples who are potentially also having children, or you've got an extended family around you. So mom has a tremendous amount of social support. We know for sure through that book I was mentioning, Brain Rules for Baby, which has a whole bunch of studies in it, that children are to learn more from and are guided by socialization more than anything else. And the TV screen does not do it. So you need socialization is not just mom talking to baby when, you know, dad's out at work. Socialization is mom talking to another adult, at least one other person. It has to be more like 3 or 4 is what they found. So what happened in the 30s and 40s? You had the destruction of the extended family networks. You had the introduction of these nuclear families where dad's out, you know, working. They dumped a lot of money into industry so that it seemed really good at the time. You could have these appliances, everybody got a car, you could live in a leave it to beaver neighborhood. But what was happening was a basically invasive form of subtle neglect and psychological trauma. Every child grown from that age didn't have the social nutrients, as I like to call it, that they need. And then what do we have in the 60s? We have all those kids getting used for the Cultural Revolution warfare stuff. So it's like, yeah, it just traces so well. When you understand the stuff you were just talking about the war college and the selection process and all these kind of things, it gives us answers as to why the stuff we actually did see, which is the stuff in the 60s, really became so popular and powerful.
They couldn't have done, I don't even think they could do MK Ultra without these studies that they were doing from World War I and World War II. Yeah. I really think that they laid the groundwork for them to be able to do MK Ultra. So,
yeah, exactly.
And when you talk about like neglect, right? Bowlby was another one of the Tavistock psychologists, and he was known for his studies on attachment theory, Some of those were horrific, right? In order to study the attachment, there was a lot of abandonment. And this is where we get, and I've always had this theory that they've intentionally created a lot of borderline personality disorder. And when you look at the MK Ultra studies, I think there is a lot of evidence that indicates that. But I think it is actually even earlier with some of these Tavistock psychologists and like attachment theory studies. But you look at what they say, there's a anxious and ambivalent childhood, because there's that saying, right, that children of alcoholics fare better than children of schizophrenics. Right? There's a
heard that,
it's fare worse than children of schizophrenics. And the reason for that is because the alcoholics, you don't know, they're not reliable. Sometimes their caretaker is going to be very present and very reliable and loving, and other times they may not be. They may be absent. And with schizophrenic, you know what you're dealing with. You know that you can't. And this is where we get with the attachment theories. We have like the secure attachment, unsecure attachment, and then there's the anxious avoidant attachment theory. And this all comes out of Bowlby's research. And the anxious ambivalent is where a lot of the they say that this is what leads to what they call RAD, which is reactionary attachment disorder. And there were some studies that were indicating there might be like a genetic kind of predisposition, but reactionary attachment disorder is a result of anxious ambivalent attachment, which is from anxious ambivalent childhood rearing practices, which then become a precursor to borderline personality disorder. They found a very high correlation between the two. And so what do we live in our society now? As you said, we've destroyed, they've decimated this notion of an extended family. So they created this nuclear family. Now they're destroying the nuclear family. So you've got these children who, a lot of them are, even if you've got a healthy, 2-parent home, a lot of times just for, financial reasons, you can't have both, of them present. And even if you can have one present, that seems to be a luxury these days. And so the children are in these environments where, and of course, we're being bombarded with all sorts of stressors and demoralization, instability. And so now the likelihood of having a child grow up with a secure attachment is much more rare. And so the likelihood of having a borderline personality increases. And I think that that's I really do think that that's a lot of that's by design. Of course, I can only speak to with certitude, I can only speak to the research that was done. But when you look at the society, who is going to be much more susceptible to programming, to brainwashing, to indoctrination is going to be people who don't have strong identity and strong sense of self. And who are those people? Those are the people who have anxious ambivalent attachments and who become reactionary attachment disorder and then become borderline personalities. So,
100%. I mean, the trans agenda and all the horrible things happening with that, where it's kind of giving us like a window into what you were just describing, because I'm not familiar enough with the terminology, but I know that most kids who decide to identify as trans often have a destabilized inner family unit. And, with the advent of social media, one of the things they've done is they've taken that normal yearning to detach from your family and find your identity out in the community, and they weaponize that to where now that happens through their big tech surveillance device that feeds you the kind of media they want you to feed you. And they have all these sophisticated ways of weaponizing that. So we're kind of getting a window into, what you were just talking about through that subject of the trans agenda and things like this. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is, you erode people of their core sense of self and identity, and you strip children of an opportunity to be in an environment where they're going to have the opportunity to create a strong sense of self and an identity. And then now you're brainwashing them with these ideas that the only way they can belong to a group, and you do sensitivity training tactics on them, which is essentially what they did with a lot of these trans, right? They're creating these group dynamics where they otherize you, right? You're outside if you're not one of us, and if you're, and then they guilt you, right? This is a lot of the kind of or you're privileged because you're of a normal, and this is sensitivity training tactics. And so now if you're left out of the group, then you're traumatized, and then they're part of the ways that you can heal is to bond with the group. So I think that's a lot of this is where that comes from, where the rise of that comes from. But it wouldn't be effective if you had strong, stable, families and communities where people had strong values and a strong personal identity rather than a group identity. And that's really all of this comes from. And sensitivity training is where they were able to brainwash people into these various group dynamics, right? This is all the Research Center for Group Dynamics, and so that they would feel a sense of belonging. But in that sense of belonging, they lose their sense of self.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it's a very tricky thing, and like you said, if you don't have the early bonds to deal with it as a child through your healthy community, the rates of mental illness in secular single parent homes is way higher than in non-secular, mom and dad homes, especially where there's more than, just mom and dad there doing everything. So, and then there's the studies with the anime. I don't know if I've ever heard it before, but I forget his name, but he made a definitive correlation between anime exposure of especially young girls and the incidence of transgenderism. And so you've got this whole you're supposed to be seeing faces of people at a certain age. You don't see faces of people because mom and dad are working and they need to, mom's got to do whatever, dad's got to do whatever. So they plunk you in front of the TV for 5 hours a day, and you're watching cartoons. And what do cartoons depict? Often is the faces that are highly exaggerated, so that co-regulative neurology, which our minds and our visual cortex is designed to bond and attach with faces more than anything else. So in that delicate time between 0 and 5 years old, when your central nervous system is trying to calibrate itself to well, what are the people I'm going to be engaging with, you spent more time looking at cartoons than you have actual people, and then you get all sorts of things happening from that. So anyway, yeah, it's really remarkable. And like I said, the stuff that you've done really speaks to the kind of the framework, the superstructure of our society that brought all this into fruition.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting when you talk about the facial movements and the co-regulation, especially with infants, right? That's the nervous system regulation comes so much from their primary caretaker and being able to discern the facial expressions. They've done some studies with infants and parents who have been Botoxed. And
really?
Yeah, and that it causes delayed development, as they're not getting the cues, right? Because the faces are frozen.
Right. Oh my God.
Yeah, I thought that was, and that research seems to be suppressed. But
Of course.
yeah.
Wow, that's a whole new layer to I hadn't even thought of, the plastic surgery angle, but literally preventing mom from having the ability to gesticulate to her children.
Yeah.
Good Lord. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was really fascinating. I mean, I don't know that I really thought about that, the impact that would have, but they did do studies on it, and they said that there were delayed development, delayed emotional development, delayed cognitive development, increased dysregulation, nervous system dysregulation. So yeah, so both ends, right? Well, the cartoons, it's not a natural human interaction. So seeing it they may get some of that exaggerated facial expression, but it's not human. So they're now having to fill the gaps and make sense of that. And then you've got the other end where there's no movement at all. And so they're feeling, I think it's a form of neglect. And I know people, this
Yes.
isn't to shame anybody.
Right.
It's neglect because the infant has no way of understanding. And so they just think that they're not getting a reaction. They think they're not getting the intimacy that they need. And so it
Precisely.
ended up being a form of, and which we've seen, neglect, as you said, is one of the most traumatic, right? They did that other study. It was with Russian infants where they gave them everything they needed, and I always blank on the name of the study.
Oh yeah.
Look it up. But they gave them everything, all their basic needs were met. They had food, they had shelter, water, but they weren't touched. And every single one of the infants died. They all died. So, yeah.
So powerful. Yeah, it's remarkable. One thing I wanted to mention, I wish I could remember his name. Hopefully it comes from before the interview ends, because we're talking about some obviously pretty horrible stuff. Unfortunately, we've all been exposed to this agenda. I grew up with cartoons. My parents both worked. So it's like we all got hit pretty hard with it. So no shame on anyone, obviously, when we talk about these things. But there is a man, I cannot remember his name, but he did studies with rapid eye movement therapy. Specifically, he wasn't trying to cure people of homosexuality, but that was the side effect of what he was able to do. And he was just doing trauma specifically related to the kind of co-regulation circuitry in the brain. Like if you do rapid eye movement with people and you get them to do a thing, I don't remember the details, but you can also give them a tool to heal very deep, old trauma, old in the sense that it's old in their intellectual architecture, like, 0 to 3 years old, which is really hard to do. And the side effect to this was that if the person's trauma could be healed with respect to their central nervous system, where they actually felt a central nervous system change, a kind of change of state, a change of the framework, then their desire for homosexuality would also kind of go with it, which is a really crazy thing to think about. But so the reason I say that is we have tools that can heal a lot of this stuff. And this is where it kind of gets almost spiritual, because it's like, I really feel like there's no problem that the horrible people in this world can inflict on us that doesn't have some type of solution in it, which I kind of think speaks to the nature of reality itself. But anyway, I'll try to remember his name.
Well, they have shown that there's like a very, very high correlation between early like sexual abuse and homosexuality. And that does kind of make sense in, psychology would call it reparations. So this is this idea where, and they've done many studies on this, but it's this idea where if you, none of us had a perfect childhood, even those of us who had, what seems really idyllic and perfect. Nobody is perfect, right? And the interesting thing about trauma is that, and they've done these studies with twins, it's that trauma isn't about the event, it's about the response to the event. So they've had twins who were, they experienced the exact same upbringing. They had both had the same event happen to them, and one twin was traumatized by the event, and the other totally was unfazed, and it did not traumatize them. And it is about framing. Yeah. I thought that one was fascinating. And they've done several of those studies, but I think it's really fascinating when they do it with twins, because now there's shared genetics, shared experiences, and they have completely separate, different responses to it. And the trauma is in the response. And so I think when you think about, because nobody had a perfect upbringing, and even if they had what would be perceived as being quite idyllic, there's always a reaction that somebody might have to something where they could be traumatized by it, because it's really about the reaction. It's about the response. And so if you think about it that way, then there's always things that we, didn't get. There's always traumas that are unresolved. And through our life, what the psychologists call it is, they call it reparations, where you would think that if we had a very traumatic experience with a primary caretaker, that we would want to avoid that in our adult conscious relationships, right? We would try not to recreate that, but we actually do the opposite. is what they
Mm-hmm.
argue. We recreate that dynamic in order to try and heal it so that we could have a different experience with
Mm-hmm.
the person. And so,
Fascinating. Yep.
and that's what they found with, so I think that's part of why you see such a high correlation. And I'm not saying it causes it. Obviously, there are plenty of people who had, that experience and they did not choose that path. But I think that that is part of why there's such a high correlation, because they're trying to correct and heal, resolve the trauma that they experience. Ironically, oftentimes it perpetuates the trauma. It's not the right, and
Yeah.
yeah, but so
Yeah, it's fascinating. I remember the guy. I just wanted to mention it to him. His name's Joseph Nicolosi. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us. He died mysteriously. And but he has something called where is it here? Reparative therapy.
yeah.
So I'll put the link in the chat, guys, or the description if you guys want to take a look at it. So, but anyway, okay.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on like an hour and a half or so. Why don't we start to wind down, and then we'll
Sure.
lead into our next episode. What do you think?
Okay, great. Yeah. I mean, I think this is, we can totally wind down here. And the next time, I think what I would like to do is kind of go through some of kind of coming out of the wartime period, coming out of the whole restructuring of Operation Phoenix, and coming and creating the actual Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, because that's where we start getting into a lot of what we're seeing today. And I think it's where what I see, you talk about like the trans movement. I think Tavistock was very instrumental in that. That's what made people aware that they even existed. And I think so much of it is about creating a cultural, really a brainwashing into transhumanism. I think it's a segue. Because if you have this idea of there's no, you blurred all the boundaries and there's no meaning to male, female, and you can just choose and you can be whatever, then what difference does it make if we merge with machine? What difference does it make if we're Borgs, right? I think that it's a easier leap for people to make. And I think that that's a large part of when you start looking at what Tavistock is working on today. They do these like symposiums on accepting machines and, of course, cybernetics and the cultural integration of the technology and merging with machines. And they have also, there was one, and it was so explicit. And I had screenshot it. I probably have it somewhere like on my Instagram from a while ago, but it was like a, workshop they were doing. And I think it got like 4 views on their page and then they deleted it. So yeah, they
Very
do
interesting.
a lot of like, yeah, they do that periodically. So maybe I could find it on the Wayback Machine, but it was really about how, I can't remember how they worded it, but something to the effect of like, the younger generation. It was about the youth, and I can't remember how they worded it, but it was essentially like grooming them to accept merging with machine.
Wow.
And I'm paraphrasing. That's not what they said, but it would that was the gist. But that, yeah, they're, but if you look on their site now, they do talk about praxis. They talk about Gnostic reticulus and how it's their time. They talk about change agents and how you can become a good change agent. This was the Leicester conferences are all about, is becoming a good change agent. And I was considering going to the Leicester conference, mostly just to learn, right?
Right.
It's coming up, I believe, in September. But it's essentially a 2-week sensitivity training program. And I was like, I don't really think I want to spend that kind of money to go do a brainwashing. And I did it. So I guess I'll close out with this. So when I did these workshops, they were like, you every time you walk into the room and every time you leave, they have you hold hands like in a seance. And both groups that I did, they both did this. So I think this is a thing. Like, this is kind of a common theme. They played the song Imagine, which is totally like communist.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
And everybody would cry. They would hold hands. You would do this like group crying, so now you're bonding through this. And then they would start every session with it, and they would end every session with it. And they did all sorts of like role playing, with like I was talking about those techniques, but it was very traumatic. Yeah. So
I bet. Wow.
firsthand experienced it, and I was like, I'm not interested in going to a 2-week thing where I spent a fortune, to learn more about it. I think I've had enough. but
Right. Yeah, you could back us to a different person. You'd be all about Klaus Schwab and New World Order and all these other things.
I remember saying I brought my sister in it, and I remember saying to her that like I knew it was communist brainwashing, but there were still things that we could get out of it. And as long as you understand that this is a communist brainwashing program, I think we should. And because we went in with that mindset, I actually think there were like beneficial aspects. And so, I had recently had somebody who was going to come on my show, and I had said they wanted to talk about group therapy and the benefits of group therapy, and how, we all need to recover from a lot of the trauma we've experienced in the past few years. And I said, well, I'm very concerned about the weaponization of group therapy, because the research I've done, it's really about brainwashing us into a collectivist group think mindset. And I just want to caveat that and say that I'm not saying that nobody can benefit ever from group therapy. In fact, I actually think that, the original Gestalt therapy research that was done had a lot of merit. And I think that Kurt Lewin subverted it. And, he had a lot of really interesting ties, right? With MIT, with the Office of Naval Research, with obviously the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. So I don't know what strings were being pulled on him, but it does seem like he made some sort of proverbial or maybe literal bargaining with the devil. And I think a lot of the original Gestalt therapy tactics were actually subverted and have been weaponized. So all this just to say that, that it's not that there can't be any benefits to group therapy, but unfortunately, I think we need to be really cognizant of how much it has been weaponized. And that if you are going to be engaged in some sort of group therapy, I think the person needs to also have some very strong identity and self individual work, done simultaneously to maintain a sense of self.
100%. Yeah. Let me add to what you just said, because it's totally true. Like most group therapy I've studied, because I've studied quite a bit of group therapy, and, through the work I did with the charity I was with, the Dr. Whitfield charity.
Oh, yeah.
And he used group therapy, and he had a lot of success with it, but it had to be done in the right way. And one of the most important things is that, so you can either create a social environment through trust, where a person can think about and contemplate and have the ability to kind of play with aspects of themselves they normally don't do because they're not in the right social setting. And that can be very helpful if they're in the driver's seat. They're the one who's actually doing the processing.
Exactly.
But if it's the other way around, where you're having to conform and kind of be vulnerable and go through these, struggle session, sensitivity training, like we're going to use strong emotion without that cognitive driver's seat component to it, then it kind of has the opposite effect. Yes. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there for people.
Yeah, that's 100%. And I think that, if we can take something from all of these really dark kind of, research experiments that they've done, is to learn maybe the ways we can flip that and use it for good. Because it's not, the research of itself is not nefarious. My concern with all of it is they've done so much of it covertly, and I think that's why they do it through wartime research. That's my contention, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support it. But I think that if we can learn, if they can weaponize it, we can also learn something. It's not that it doesn't have merit; it's that they've weaponized it and they've used it for, unfortunately, to control people. So.
Right. Exactly. Well, Courtney, this has been great. I've really enjoyed the second installment to the Tavistock series. So I'm going to have the links. I'm going to try to grab all the awesome books you mentioned throughout the episode and put them in the description for everybody.
Good question.
Also, yeah, exactly. I'll put in your channel as well, because I know you've talked about this before on your Rumble channel. So I'll make sure that's in there. And also, I wanted to give you a chance to just talk about the Liberty Summit again.
Yes.
So you want to just talk about that for a second as we close out?
Yeah, sure. So it's the Cognitive Liberty Conference, and that is at cognitivelibertyconference.com. This is going to be in Nashville, Tennessee, August 16th and 17th. And we have both live stream and in-person tickets available. The in-person tickets are very limited seating, and we are going to be focusing on really unpacking and uncovering so much of these tactics that we've discussed from Tavistock. We might not address Tavistock specifically, but this is ways that you can build your own cognitive liberty, because when you understand the history and when you understand how things have been weaponized, then you can use your conscious cognitive reasoning and that is, I think, a bulwark against their control measures. So, and I think it's also a way that one of the things they really want to do, we talked about day 2 is going to be on the dialectic, and they really are so determined to divide us. And I think it's so important that we come together. That doesn't mean that you lose sight of what's important to you. That doesn't mean that you, concede all of your convictions and your belief systems. It means that we unite about the things that are important. I really feel the only 2 teams there should be are the parasite class and Team Humanity. They literally say they want to create Humanity 2.0. I think in order to create Humanity 2.0, that means Humanity 1.0 ceases to exist. And I kind of like Humanity 1.0 with our foibles and all. So
Exactly. 100%. Well, awesome. Courtney, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.